The war in Ukraine is not a spontaneous conflict, nor is it simply a case of one nation defending itself against another's aggression. Rather, it is the latest chapter in a long and deliberate campaign of geopolitical manipulation, executed by Western intelligence agencies, financial institutions, and ruling elites to weaken Russia, consolidate global power, and expand the influence of NATO. The origins of this war stretch back far before the 2022 Russian invasion, rooted in decades of calculated interventions, regime changes, and economic warfare designed to destabilize the region and draw Russia into a prolonged and costly engagement. To fully grasp the nature of this war, one must look beyond the surface-level narratives presented by mainstream media and understand the deeper forces at play, the real architects behind the conflict and their ultimate objectives. The roots of the Ukraine conflict can be traced back to the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Western leaders made a series of promises to Russia that NATO would not expand eastward toward its borders. These assurances, however, were repeatedly violated as NATO absorbed nearly every former Soviet satellite state, encircling Russia with a growing military presence. Ukraine, as a critical buffer state between Russia and Western Europe, became the ultimate prize in this strategic expansion. When Ukraine's leadership hesitated to fully align with Western interests, intelligence agencies orchestrated regime change operations to install compliant governments that would serve NATO's objectives. The most pivotal moment in this plan came in 2014, when a CIA-backed coup overthrew the democratically elected pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. Protests had been escalating in Kiev's Maidan Square, supposedly as a grassroots movement against government corruption. But in reality, these protests were carefully engineered through Western intelligence assets, funding from NGOs, and a sophisticated psychological operations campaign. The Maidan Massacre, in which dozens of protesters were killed by unknown snipers, was the decisive turning point. Western media quickly blamed the violence on Yanukovych's forces, providing the justification for his removal. However, later investigations revealed that the snipers were actually operatives working with neo-Nazi paramilitary groups that had been trained and funded by the United States to carry out false flag operations. This engineered bloodshed provided the necessary cover for the coup, which installed a government loyal to Western interests, setting Ukraine firmly on the path toward NATO integration and direct confrontation with Russia. The overthrow of Ukraine's government in 2014 did not occur in isolation. It was part of a broader strategy to weaken Russia economically, politically, and militarily. The United States and its allies immediately began transforming Ukraine into a de facto military outpost. Billions of dollars in military aid poured into the country, arming its forces and strengthening its intelligence networks. Meanwhile, economic pressure was ramped up against Russia through sanctions, currency manipulation, and the targeting of key industries. Western intelligence agencies worked behind the scenes to stir nationalist and anti-Russian sentiments within Ukraine, fostering internal divisions and ensuring that any pro-Russian factions within the country would be silenced or eliminated. In response, Russia took decisive action to secure its strategic interests. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was not an act of unprovoked aggression, as Western media portrayed it, but a necessary response to the coup in Kiev. Crimea, home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet and a predominantly Russian-speaking population, had every reason to break away from Ukraine and align itself with Moscow. A referendum was quickly held and the people of Crimea overwhelmingly voted to join Russia. Yet, despite the clear popular mandate, the West refused to acknowledge this democratic process, labeling it an illegal annexation and using it as a pretext for further sanctions and military escalations against Russia. The situation in eastern Ukraine followed a similar trajectory. The regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, collectively known as the Donbas, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the post-coup government in Kiev. Separatists in these areas, many of whom had deep cultural and historical ties to Russia, declared independence and sought Moscow's support. In response, the Ukrainian military launched brutal offensives against these separatist regions, using cluster munitions and other indiscriminate weapons to bombard civilian areas. Western media largely ignored or downplayed these war crimes, despite overwhelming evidence of Ukrainian forces deliberately targeting Russian-speaking populations. Over the next 8 years, this simmering conflict in the Donbas would claim thousands of lives, with both sides engaging in sporadic fighting and failed attempts at ceasefire agreements. The Minsk Agreements, brokered to bring an end to hostilities in the Donbas, were never intended to be honored by the West. While Russia pushed for diplomatic solutions, Ukraine, under Western direction, repeatedly violated these accords, escalating attacks and provoking further instability. In the years leading up to 2022, NATO military exercises near Russia's borders became more aggressive, while Western officials openly discussed integrating Ukraine into the alliance. These moves were deliberate provocations designed to force Russia into a difficult decision: either allow NATO to fully militarize Ukraine and threaten Russian security directly, or take preemptive action to neutralize the growing threat. When Russia finally launched its military operation in February 2022, it was not a rash invasion but a calculated response to years of Western encroachments. Vladimir Putin laid out clear terms for de-escalation. Ukraine must renounce NATO membership ambitions, recognize Crimea as Russian territory, and grant autonomy to the Donbas republics. However, rather than pursuing diplomatic solutions, the West seized upon the conflict as an opportunity to further its own agenda. The United States and NATO flooded Ukraine with weaponry, prolonging the war and ensuring maximum destruction. This was never about defending Ukraine's sovereignty. It was about using Ukraine as a sacrificial pawn in a broader war against Russia. The financial and military aid provided to Ukraine has not been an act of altruism, but a calculated investment by the military-industrial complex and Western oligarchs. Billions of dollars have been funneled into arms manufacturers, private military contractors, and intelligence operations under the guise of supporting Ukraine's defense. Meanwhile, Ukraine's economy has been pillaged through IMF loans and asset seizures, ensuring that the country remains in permanent debt servitude to Western financial institutions. The longer the war drags on, the more profits are made by defense contractors and international banking elites, while the Ukrainian people suffer the consequences. Western intelligence agencies have played a critical role in shaping the perception of the war, using media manipulation and psychological warfare to craft a one-sided narrative. Russian actions are portrayed as reckless aggression, while Ukraine's atrocities are ignored or excused. Social media platforms, working hand-in-hand with intelligence agencies, have aggressively censored alternative perspectives, ensuring that only the official version of events is disseminated. The demonization of Russia serves not only to justify the war, but also to distract from the corruption and crimes of Western governments themselves. The same intelligence agencies that orchestrated regime change in Ukraine are the ones shaping the narrative, ensuring that dissenting voices are silenced. The ultimate goal of this conflict extends far beyond Ukraine itself. The war serves as a tool to weaken Russia, consolidate NATO's power, and push the world closer to a unipolar order dominated by Western elites. The destruction of Nord Stream, an act of sabotage likely carried out by intelligence agencies, was designed to sever Europe's energy ties with Russia, forcing greater economic dependence on the United States. The economic sanctions against Russia, while publicly framed as punitive measures, have in reality backfired, accelerating the global move away from the US dollar and reshaping international alliances. As nations begin to recognize the West's manipulations, a new multipolar world order is emerging, one where countries seek to break free from Western dominance. Despite the immense destruction, Ukraine remains a battlefield not just in the literal sense, but as a testing ground for the future of warfare, where financial manipulation, information warfare, and covert operations are used as weapons just as much as missiles and tanks. The war is not about defending democracy or sovereignty. It is about control, profit, and the ongoing struggle for global hegemony. Ukraine, like so many nations before it, has been caught in the gears of an empire that views human lives as expendable, so long as they serve the interests of those at the top. This war is not the end game. It is merely another step in the relentless march of an elite determined to rule the world through deception, coercion, and destruction.